Great, thank you, Jess. In which case, we should be ready to begin. Therefore, on the motion that this House would apply universal jurisdiction to crimes against the environment, I'd like to call upon the Prime Minister to open the case for opening government. Hear, hear.
Okay, I'm going to assume everyone can hear me, and I'll take POIs in the chat, please. Starting in 3, 2, 1. 3 claims from opening government. First, just getting into what universal jurisdiction is. Secondly, what this looks like and why it will be done well. And thirdly, why this is effective for ensuring that harms against the environment are going to be stopped internationally on a far faster scale than what they can claim on opposition. First, in terms of definitions, universal jurisdiction basically means that any country can prosecute anyone violating a law that they have, regardless of what that individual's nationality is, where the crime took place, or who was affected by it, for example. This is different from the status quo, in which, in general, for things regarding the environment, countries can only extend their law to the people who are directly in their own country, if that's their nationality, or if that's where the crime was taking place. This likely isn't just going to affect individuals, though, but also corporations, insofar as those are the bodies that tend to have a massive harm towards the environment in general, given their size and the scale of the resources that they consume. So why then do we think that this is going to be effective and done well? I think some countries we've seen have the capacity and the want to advance things like meeting their terms for COP26 and make strides to meet certain environmental reactions, but others have lobbyists that go against these same kind of ideas. I think that developing states, which tend to be the most affected by climate change insofar as they are closer to the equator and it is more warm there generally, have less power internationally by virtue of their limited resources. Banding together is something that they can do, but this is hard to actually coordinate and is also a very, very high burden for opposition to prove in order to actually push for any kind of legislation that could affect people who have more wealth, actually striving to meet their kind of agenda for changing the climate, or actually making sure that they're stopping the change on their side. What changes under this model is that countries have an incentive to actually prosecute in this way and to do this well. I think states, regardless of their development status, know that if they're going to actually engage in prosecuting someone or a corporation that is of another nationality, under this law, which is a far shift from the status quo, they're taking on a large burden to do this, which means they want this to go down well internationally. This means that they see it as a harm of having something like an illegitimate case with fragile evidence, insofar as this could weaken other countries' willingness to do business with you, either for international coordination or for things like engaging your economies together and working for this kind of deals. Op can say that these kind of mechanisms can also mean that this isn't likely to happen, but their comparative is that there just are not functional methods for resolution, because there are not other ways for people to pursue these kind of things insofar as the same issues that I flagged above are still existent on their side. We only need, from government side, some countries to be willing to do this, to have a massive shift in terms of what kind of changes are happening for the environment overall, and some will be willing to do this. Insofar as developing states know that it's likely they're going to lose land, lose economic viability, and have massive loss of life because of climate change hitting them first. What that means is that even if opposition wants to discuss the fact that they could be reliant on things like corporations for their own economy, likely that becomes a smaller harm on comparison to looking towards the country's future in general as they go forward. I think that considering climate change has been a massive issue that people have been talking about for a while, there's generally an understanding, regardless where you are in the world, that it's something that needs to be solved now, which means constituents, when they're talking to their politicians, are likely to be willing for them to take on the kind of burden to push for these kind of things internationally. In terms of developed states, this worldwide growing understanding can affect them as well, insofar as people are comfortable with their politicians doing this. If someone is running on a platform that says we massively care about the environment, that's the kind of thing that they're pushing for more often. That likely means that people are likely to coalesce around these things and go forward with them at least 1 or 2 times. When it's done, I think this trial is likely, given the fact that it is something that's happening in a brand new way, to have lots of resources lent to it because of the fact that it is so unique in this way, and there's likely to be international scrutiny on it, which means that any kind of backlash that opposition can push for isn't likely to happen. Why are these kind of things effective when they do happen then? We think mainly from opening government, people are going to go after things like large corporations or prominent individuals within them who are doing active things like contributing to rising sea levels, or their corporation is, or they're doing things like environmental degradation in terms of deforestation and massive harms to local environments as well. This is because these corporations have a lot of money and a lot of ability to consume more resources on comparison to the average individual, who cannot consume as many just because they don't have the finances to actually take up all of them on comparison. We think it's hard to actually go after these large bodies otherwise, just because of the fact that they tend to have so many resources to rely on. That means that through individual countries' legislation, when a corporation is one that is so massive, when there is not universal jurisdiction, it becomes very, very difficult for that country to actually crack down on the negative things that that corporation is doing. This is because when constituents are like perceiving their economy as being intrinsic to that company, or politicians have the understanding that if they were to go after that corporation, they would take a hit in the polls if it does cause harms on the economy. It's just not something that's likely to happen on a smaller level in terms of state-to-state coordination, because the fact that means that they're not likely to win their election campaigns if they have those negative hits going after them. At the same time, there's a positive comparative that exists with this as well, because these companies have massive amounts of resources and they know that they don't want to have to justify things like losses to their shareholders as there's increased regulation. They're more likely to be lobbying politicians within their own municipality, within their own country, to say, we don't want you to actually impose this regulation on us. On our side, though, if we have some countries who are willing to come out, either because they're in mortal peril due to the fact that they are facing climate change immediately, or because of the fact that they are those that actually do care about these kind of issues, they can go after these larger corporations that have this massive effect in a way that can actually lead to massive benefits. Before I get into the benefits, I'll take a PY from CO if they have one. Oh,
So in the Netherlands, the prosecution of Shell for their actions in Nigeria is probably one of the few good examples of universal jurisdiction. The Netherlands is also home to the ICC, which of course has been an enormous failure. Why do you think similar problems don't apply here?
the ICC is an international court. What we're talking about on our side is that countries who already have their own courts and their own laws are able to do this internally with them. Also, I don't really care about the specific example of the Netherlands insofar as it's not a structural reason for that could continue to happen on your side. Moving on to what happens when we do have some of these prosecutions go on. We've given you reasons why they're likely to be effective, given the fact that there is scrutiny on them, that there are resources going towards them as a result of that, and that politicians who are taking on the brunt of them do this well. I think that when corporations are actually in the place where this has been a successful court case against them, what that's likely to mean is that they're going to be sanctioned, they're going to have massive tariffs, or they're going to need to have some individuals be prosecuted, or have those individuals have their own sanctions put on them by this country. The result of that actually means that they're going to take a massive profit hit in the short term because they're not able to function at the same level they were previously. They could also have things like large fines levied on them for the kind of negative behavior they're having towards the environment going forward. Those kind of things are not just bad in terms of meeting their bottom line, which companies need to justify to their shareholders. It also means that they're concerned about the PR that's happening towards them, which means people are less likely to want to buy their products generally and are as likely to want to buy their stock generally, which means that they're going to lose more money in general. Insofar as corporations are rational actors, when they have the fear that they're going to be hit at this level, at least, even if that court case only happens once or twice, they're more likely to change their behavior into the future to do the negative acts towards climate change less often, slowing down the rate at which people's lives are being lost actively from our side, at the same time as we're likely to see massive reforms into the future in terms of them being able to do things like invest in renewables, diversify away from fossil fuels more often on our side, all those reasons. OG.
I would like to thank the Prime Minister for what was a fine speech, and I'd like to call upon the Leader of Opposition to begin the case for opening opposition. Hear, hear.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes.
I think the first thing I want to say about opening government's case and their entire model is that it's very unclear how enforceable it's ever going to be, because it seems to be that any country can literally say, oh, you on a different country have contravened our laws, therefore we're going to somehow prosecute you. Firstly, how are they going to get that individual or the CEO of that company in order to prosecute them? Secondly, why is that going to result in actual changes in that company when that company does not think that they're likely to be prosecuted, especially if it's a government organized company, like, for example, the government sponsored companies like the logging companies in Brazil? It's unlikely that you're ever going to go that far. The second problem, however, with opening government's model and case is the very facts and analysis that they gave to us, that countries, because they care about this, want to make sure that they only use this in cases where it's so obvious that there's been this environmental harm, which means that significantly limits the number of instances where countries are ever going to take these cases to the most obvious cases in the world, which means a vast majority of the more pernicious forms of environmental harms, like slow deforestation, like literal runoff that require a lot of investigation to prove, or things like high emissions aren't likely to be counted under all the prosecutions they are bringing to you, which means either opening government has to standardize this somehow and have a form of treaty that allows countries to opt in for that enforceability to happen, or they are unable to make any change at all. I think we'll let closing government decide how they want to deal with that model. The first thing I want to note, though, before I move on to my points, is that all of the mechanisms that they brought to us in order to change company behavior, to change country behavior, to align those costs with negative externalities can be done through a much more direct method over things like trade, right? So on our side, we support strengthening local jurisdictions and providing the incentive to things like the carbon border adjustment mechanism. There are a lot of Western countries on our side, we think, if they're likely to adopt this level of, intervention in other countries, would do so as well. And that is a couple of things. The first thing is that it then aligns the incentives of those countries with their voters, right? So if developed world voters care about the environment and want to protect from that harm and want to avoid carbon leaking into their economies, then they're able to put tariffs on carbon intensive products that don't match their level of carbon protection, right? And that's what the EU has done. We think, yes, that this will piss off developing countries as they describe, but piss them off far less because there's a more structured and more regulated system where they can point to EU regulations of carbon harm and carbon emission and therefore test whether that is a valid cost to put on the goods that are being imported into the EU from developing countries. Comparatively, on their side, they destroy any hope of any collaboration of developing countries, which means that they're unable to get change for those developing countries or for the world in general. So it follows that I'm going to explain why the system simply doesn't work and instead pisses off developing countries to a maximum amount, but also isn't likely to be prosecuted well, and there's a lot of problems around it, which means that you lose trust in the system even before it's set up. And then secondly, explain the outcomes of that. Why, firstly, that destroys government's case because they actually aren't making any change, but harms the collaboration of other things as well, like the loss and damage fund that was just set up in Indonesia, which will be very good for developing countries. Developing countries aren't likely to opt into all those kinds of negotiations if that universal jurisdiction is then going to be fostered upon them. So firstly, why does the system not work? I think I've already explained a lot around why this is not going to be used in the instances where they can actually make maximum change, which means all the changes they're likely to do in the slam dunk cases is very, very marginal. But also secondly, note that they say, oh, this is unlikely to happen in instances where there's economic harm to countries. And so therefore that means as well, the developed countries that are taking these cases are unlikely to do it when there's significant uncertainty in the level of economic harm that would happen if companies stop doing certain things, which I think in the fact that developing countries themselves are likely to define that level of economic dependence to a certain industry are unlikely to be ever resolved. So which means that either developing countries aren't going to collaborate with the prosecution from other countries, or developed countries aren't likely to do that, or there's a massive international problem where you are prosecuting and the other country isn't actually going along with it, which results to what, are you going to invade that country in order to make the change? It's unclear if there's no governing body that sets the standards. What did they say for this? They said developing states are the most affected by climate change, and therefore they're the ones that are most likely to want this change and therefore opt into these kinds of prosecutions. That fundamentally is contradictory with their later analysis about how economic dependency or economic harms are really important and constituents care about the economy. Let me bridge this gap for you. So the first thing to note, though, is even if people care about the harms of climate change in terms of floods and droughts, because they can see that, it's unlikely that these kinds of prosecutions are ever going to handle the kinds of emissions that harm, that actually contribute to climate change, because there is no causal link between every ounce of carbon that's emitted and the aggregating factors in a very complicated chaos type 2 system, which means that you can't isolate why one part of carbon that was emitted by one country actually created the harms in another country. So legally, that is not an issue. This is likely to be pollution within countries and maybe runoff with the countries bordering it, but that is significantly different from the level of harm that people see from things like floods and droughts, right? And so therefore, firstly, a lot of these developing countries, their main priority is the short-term harm from poverty, right? These individuals are less educated, which means it's hard to explain to them the long-term effects of pollution, because that happens way into the future, but also happens underneath the surface, so you can't really see that. But also they're just generally more short-termist because they have to survive another couple of days. And that level, if you believe this is a democratic country, that level of pressure goes up towards politicians. I'll take a point from opening government in a bit. The second reason here, the second response to what opening government said, is that politicians have a lot of, politicians need to care about those constituents. So I can't take a sorry. Even if politicians So the problem is that politicians don't necessarily have the same link to their constituents. Politicians have a lot of control over the system in the status quo in developing countries, right? They have propaganda. It's very easy to have the narrative that developed countries are fostering unfair standards upon them, and therefore they're unlikely to go with this system. That means the developing countries, which is essential for future emissions, given the developing world will overtake the developed world, with India and Nigeria becoming industrialized, which means that if developing countries don't obtain, as I've proven already, you're unlikely to make any change at all. But there are problems that are inherent with this, right? Because double standards are clearly exposed when like for example, when ICC only prosecutes African dictators, when European countries don't prosecute the US for the similar kinds of things, but only prosecute developing countries, that undermines the trust in the system already. But the fact that that already exists in certain systems already, and there's a narrative fostered by China and Russia that the West is unfair and a bully in these kinds of things, means that even in the initial system, you're never going to get any kinds of buy-in. Why is this harmful? You lose collaboration on other things like CBAM, you lose collaboration in the loss and damage fund that was set up in Indonesia, but you also carve out a space for China to take control. They have that incentive because they want to have their own hegemony, but also want to maintain stockpiles of we destroy the global consensus around environmental change, and actually means that they harm all the things that they want to.
I'd like to thank the Leader of Opposition for what was a fine speech. I'd like to remind all speakers to please take at least 1 point of information in each of their speeches. I'd like to call upon the Deputy Prime Minister to continue the case for opening government. Hear, hear.
All right. Can everyone hear me? And is everyone ready for me to annoy the patrons of this Panera?
Yes.
All right. Starting in 3, 2, 1. 2 things in this speech. Firstly, responses to opening opposition. Secondly, new substantive on why this is not only a principally legitimate thing to do, but is actually a moral imperative that nations have the responsibility to do. Firstly, responses to opening opposition. The first thing I want to highlight is that opening opposition's case is almost entirely mitigatory. They spend most of their speech basically just saying this won't happen and only briefly explain what they would rather happen instead and why that is like mutually exclusive with a world where universal jurisdiction is applied. I want to point out that our burden from opening government isn't to say that this is going to be successful every single time we might theoretically want to prosecute something. I think what we actually have to prove is 2 things. Firstly, that we will prosecute sometimes enough to create a significant delta that doesn't require prosecuting every single instance of pollution, even if we can only get some instances of excessive emissions or some instances of polluting natural resources. That's still a significant delta because 1, it will often save that particular resource so we can keep that particular river clean and benefit everyone who needs the water from that river, just as one example. And 2, because even slowing the rate of emissions helps climate change, even if it doesn't stop emissions entirely, because even slowing the rate of emissions gives us more time to find technological solutions and also more time to adjust to a warmer planet. For example, even if this doesn't stop climate change, even if it slows it down, if an island country goes underwater in 50 years, we have way more time to adjust and plan for what we're going to do with the refugees and so on than if that country goes underwater in 10 years. So basically, we don't need to prove that we prosecute every single case we theoretically want to. We only have to prove that it happens sometimes. And the other thing is that even prosecuting sometimes has more cascading effects than just the individual cases that we prosecute, because it creates a chilling effect. Companies are afraid that they might be prosecuted next, even if prosecutions are fairly uncommon, because the cost of being prosecuted is very high. It is an extremely bad PR move, or it's extremely bad for your public relations to have a very big trial that gets a lot of news attention suggesting that you are polluting excessively, and it's extremely expensive to deal with the trial, even if you think you'll win. And so what that means is that companies want to avoid any risk that they will be prosecuted, and so companies that previously acted with impunity are far less likely to do so. With that said, let's respond to their reasons that they said that this won't happen. So they were like, how are you going to get the CEO? And like, you know, how are you going to like get, you know, other nations to enforce these laws on those countries? So I think there were basically a couple things to say. I think firstly, countries in general want this mechanism to exist in general, even if they don't want it to happen to themselves. And so they have an incentive to create a norm where countries do cooperate with this. What do I mean by this? We're at the point now where most educated people in the world recognize that climate change is a major threat to the world and recognize that they and the countries they live in will be affected by it. What that means is that there is a large collective benefit to this mechanism existing and doing something about climate change. And what that means is that not just just like, the leaders, the leaders of countries, the educated people within countries, and the ordinary citizens of those countries, all of these people want this mechanism to exist and want companies to pollute less, meaning that even if there's some cost to them, they're likely to cooperate with it, because if they defect, that highly increases the probability that other countries will defect, meaning that they know that like this has that effect, that it makes climate change more likely. So that's a reason that many nations have an incentive to cooperate. But the other thing to say is that even if nations don't always cooperate, this gives you the legitimacy to hold companies accountable in other ways. So even if a company isn't even if we can't get the nation that a particular company is operating on to cooperate, we can get other countries to participate in sanctions against a particular company for actions they're doing in a nation that isn't cooperating. So this has benefits even if nations don't always cooperate. And they say like only the most obvious things will be prosecuted. We're fine with this. The most obvious things are probably the biggest and most impactful ones. They say that this won't be done when there are economic harms, but that's not what we said. What we said is that the economic harms will be taken into account and a balance of interests will be found. We think that like people really want to stop climate change, and there's going to be some willingness to incur economic harms in order to do so. It's just not going to be like bulldozing small developing countries and never giving them anything that they want. That's I think the balance that we strike, and I think it's a good balance to strike. Also, the other reason that there will be that this is just likely to happen is that in progressive countries such as the Netherlands, for example, politicians want to prove that to their people that they're doing something about climate change. So there's a large incentive to initiate these trials. The other thing they say, so what they want to happen instead is some kind of like international cooperation, or just like the EU putting tariffs on carbon intensive products. I was a little unclear on what they want, but I'll respond to both of them. I'll firstly say that they probably can't like counterprop some kind of international cooperation, because that requires way more nations to buy into it, that rather than universal jurisdiction, where we don't have to use our fiat power to say that everyone will buy in. We just have to use our fiat power to say that a few nations will be prosecuting. With that said, why is some kind of international deal unlikely to come about and a very bad alternative? I think international deals are very difficult to do for two reasons. Firstly, they take a very long time to negotiate because you have to balance the interests of dozens and dozens of countries. That is an extremely complicated negotiation. And it is very difficult to actually get everyone on the same page, because there's literally like there's something like 180, 190 countries in the world. It's very hard to get them all on the same page. But two, enforcement mechanisms also require this level of coordination. So the Paris Climate Accord is probably their best example. And the Paris Climate Accord, one, because of the problems in negotiation, is totally inadequate, even if it was actually carried through. And two, wasn't carried through because it lacked a good enforcement mechanism, because enforcement would require a lot of countries to cooperate, whereas our mechanism only requires one. Does CO have anything?
Yeah, so I'm still confused. So universal jurisdiction presumably implies universal laws. So whose laws, or are you genuinely claiming that any country can prosecute anyone on the basis of their own whatever laws they choose?
Yeah, so that second thing where countries can prosecute anyone they want is the meaning of the word universal jurisdiction. That's what it means. That's what the Netherlands did. That's what this motion is. If you are worried that this is going to mean that developed countries just steamroll developing ones, one, developing countries can just refuse to cooperate if things get too bad. So the lack of cooperation that OO cites as a harm is actually a good thing, because it allows us to balance the economic harms with benefits to the environment. And secondly, it's a trial, and so there is a defense in this trial, and the judge has an incentive to balance the interests of both the economy and the environment, because they don't want to ruin relations with that developing nation, meaning that there is likely to be some sort of balance there. And the last thing they say is that there are narrative harms, and I just think it's really silly to say that because people aren't like college educated or whatever, that we can't explain to them the harms of climate change. Like, this is a widespread fear, and it's not that complicated to say that the earth is getting warmer, and so the oceans are rising, and so your country will be underwater. But also a lot of the harms of pollution are very short term. Like, many people can see the company that is destroying the river or the rainforest that they rely on to survive. I think it's actually pretty popular to hold them to account. Please propose. All right, bye everyone.
I'd like to thank the Deputy Prime Minister for what was a fine speech, and I'd like to call upon the Deputy Leader of Opposition to continue the case for opening opposition. Hear, hear.
Ready?
Yes.
I want to address the nature of this power, because sure, it's great in theory. Well, actually, with the burden that the government is now taking, it's like fine in theory is what they want to stand for. What this actually is, though, is greenwashing. It is environmental carceralism at an enormous scale that allows arrogant Western actors to impose their view on the best way to deal with the very complex trade-offs of climate change and pollution instead of allowing those domestic mechanisms to take place. This, of course, will ride roughshod over the very careful negotiation that is taking place to give us actual solutions to climate change. And I'll note that this is not a counterprop. This is not a careful bit of technical debating. This is catastrophic consequences for the actual changes that are taking place currently and will be the death of both the government teams in this debate. So first thing I want to address is briefly on the principles, then talk about why this has those catastrophic outcomes. And I'll note that the opposition, the government in this debate, wanted to add some extension material on why this is a moral imperative and why we desperately need to slow down climate change. And of course, there's a point of information also from the closing opposition that wants to really like state the motion and be like, but isn't it principally bad to do the thing that you have to do in the motion? I want to be very clear that the reason why you should oppose this motion is because it will be catastrophically counterproductive to the things that it wants to achieve. It won't slow down climate change, being the like literal definition of a polycentric problem where you can't assign individual criminal responsibility, and it won't even solve pollution, which is the obvious way that this will be used, as it's used in the Netherlands. I'll accept a point of information just straight off the bat from our closing government to engage with what is the most important clash in the debate.
Okay, so your partner's main point was this will only be the really obvious big cases. Surely, if that is the only thing we can achieve in this debate, that is likely to have the biggest impact in stopping the biggest obvious cases.
Right, so that's the opening government's case, and we pointed out that it was they who are going to make this particular claim, that they'll only stop the biggest ones. What I then, and Shah has demonstrated to you, that just focusing on those individual singular cases distracts from, and in fact poses a big problem to achieving the type of negotiation. And that is the case that we got from Shah. Is there another point of information that isn't just the opening government's case, though? And I'll give you a chance to engage with something new in the debate. Okay, is there a point of information then from opening government? Any POI from opening government? Okay, excellent. I'm going to walk through then why we're able to win this by a significant margin. I'm going to explain firstly why a universal, and I note that universal is a misnomer in this debate, is actually a unilateral approach, is something that is negative, and then I'll explain why a criminalized approach is something that is negative, covering off the two big words in the motion. Okay, why is unilateral bad? And I'm going to compare this to comp, right? Because the opposition has kind of indicated that we're going to be prosecuting people for carbon emissions, right? Carbon emissions are done by millions of companies having incredibly small increases to overall carbon level in order to serve billions of consumers. It is not something you can solve through these types of criminal measures and should probably be disregarded if that's their burden of trying to win this debate. The way that we do deal with it, however, is getting nations to agree to impose individual rules as to the way that people who operate within their jurisdictions are allowed to emit carbon. And it's not, like even at the largest, it's not criminalizing people for emitting carbon, because emitting carbon is essential for almost all like quality of life on Earth. It's figuring out the way to adjust away from that system, create the necessary trade-offs in order us to do something that is good. That is something that we support very strongly on our side of the House. And we think that truly universal approach is wrecked when you allow a unilateral approach, which will likely look like places like the Netherlands, taking slam dunk cases against particular offenders, not because of the amount of carbon that they produce or the amount of pollution that they produce, but because of how easy it is to have like a domestic policy win, which doesn't address the actual causes of the way that it operates. What were the responses from the opposition? They just claimed that the West would be so careful in the way they do it. You don't want to embarrass yourself. Well, governments embarrass themselves all the time. Even if they've got incentives to do something well, it doesn't mean they have the capacity to do something well. They're often stocked by, and I'm sorry to people who are public servants who I may be debating against, often stocked by people who do not understand the complexities of the issues that they're dealing with and have career incentives to try for big goals and big aims which don't accord with the overall success of that strategy. And I'll note that though, domestic incentives is quite important because there's a careful trade-off that happens in a nation like Indonesia or a nation like Brazil, where they say, how can I preserve the stability of my political unit such that it doesn't disintegrate into something like civil war or broad unrest while still trying to achieve climate goals? The Netherlands comes in and says, why are you still polluting? Why can't we arrest you for doing this pollution? And don't take into account that careful negotiation that is happening. Yes, closing opposition.
Okay, so equally, it is hard to have things like international war crime legislation be followed by everybody. However, we do have international standards that we stand. How could you not akin crimes against the environment to that of crimes against humanity, i.e. it impacts everybody, everybody should have a say on what's just?
Absolutely. I note that just drawing the analogy to international crimes of other natures doesn't prove that it is a good thing to add that out. So I accept that there's an analogy there. I don't accept that there's any work been done by any team in this debate to explain why that's an effective thing. But the thing that I want to note, though, is that the most effective actions against like war crimes have been domestic tribunals that have international support. So it's not a nation like the Netherlands coming in and locking someone up in Den Haag. It's something like making sure that you give support to domestic prosecutions under domestic laws. And that's not about universal jurisdiction. And I struggle to see why it would be about universal jurisdiction, because the major benefit of universal jurisdiction is extraterritoriality. It simply won't help you deliver those particular goals, which is something we can have. So why does this endanger our action on comp? Two reasons. Firstly, because for a lot of actors in the developing world, they have been warned that climate legislation is a way to subvert their sovereignty and will lead to things like the nightmare that is being proposed by the government, where West is allowed to prosecute anyone who does policies that they don't agree with. But even if we accept the opposition is able to demonstrate that these are responsible actors, these nations are paranoid, right? China produces whether China's on board or not is one of the things that will determine whether or not we're successful in the fight against climate change. And if we push them away, if we push other nations towards them and encourage them to go into their sphere of influences, we don't get them on board with the actual actions that are going to be effective, and we get them to opt in to border stuff. So why is criminal bad? And our alternative is very simple in debate. We would much prefer marginal improvements to certification and border adjustment, which is the major way in which you break the link between consumers and environmental harms that drives a lot of these things, rather than particular slam dunk criminal cases only with ironclad evidence, for three reasons. Firstly, it's obviously not nearly comprehensive enough. If you look at deforestation in Latin America, it isn't driven by one big company deforesting everywhere. It's 100 companies and then tens of thousands of individuals doing informal deforestation, which is a much more complex problem that's given by the individual than the motion, and focuses people on that type of individual responsibility. But secondly, it diverts attention away from the consumers themselves. So if you take CBAM, which is the carbon border adjustment mechanism, it's actually, even though it has some harms to the developing world, much more popular than unilateral actions, because it says that, hey, Western consumers, you are the ones that are the problem. When you pass this obviously enormous policy from a symbolic perspective, you dramatically pull attention away from those other types of things, and you poison people's perspective against them by convincing them that it's big bad companies and not consumers who are driving these issues.
It's time. I'd like to thank the Deputy Leader of Opposition for what was a fine speech, and I'd like to call upon the Member of Government to begin the case for closing government. Hear, hear.
Great. All right, let's start in 3, 2, 1. Some framing to start out with before several prongs of extension. Obviously, OG in this debate do have a degree of fiat to explain what this might look like, and we're not going to knife them, but I just want to say that I do think our case will have a much broader remit when considering possible different interpretations of universal jurisdiction. So I think our case will apply regardless of whether this is use of national courts or, for example, different countries suing other countries where they may not have jurisdiction, perhaps in the International Court of Justice, for example. Our case will apply to all of these possible conceptions. With that in mind, the first thing I want to do is actually run a principle, because I really do not think that opening government have done this successfully in this debate. I think they kind of allude to the idea of climate change, but do not weaponize this and do not explain why this actually in a justified principle sense means that we ought do this. So I'm going to give you 3 principled reasons as to why it is that universal jurisdiction ought apply regardless of practical outcome. The first thing I would note is that often some environmental crimes simply have flow-on effects that are very difficult to piece together in a legalistic sense, right? So for example, if one country is producing transboundary haze, it might be very difficult to sue them if you're one border state over, but if you're the second border state and the third border state, and the harms that come from that are just like a little bit more nebulous and you can't quite concretize the health outcomes in statistical data, it basically is impossible to sue. But you still have a, general harm being inflicted on you, and maybe the first border state does not have the capacity to sue. In that situation, you should have the right to hold that state to account. The second reason, and I guess this is kind of alluded to by OG, but not that explicit, is just that there are some problems that are just universal. That is to say, insofar as you're contributing to climate change, even if you're doing it on one side of the world, the way that obviously climate change works is that it then has an impact on the other side of the world, even if you have like no fucking geographical proximity. And the third reason why you principally are entitled, I think, to sue is that you contribute to norms, right? So maybe America is fucking over some other country that's not you. But when America does that and America gets away with that, it means you normalize the idea that a country near you could do that thing into the future, right? So the fact that we exist in a world where the actions of different countries normalize our behaviors into the future means that you have a defensive or preemptive reason to sue countries to stop them from normalizing that and then that happening to you in the future. And again, I think this is just important because this right is not contingent on practical outcomes. So like just intuition pump any single criminal or civil case in any country ever, we wouldn't deny you the right to a civil suit if you're entitled to one, because that civil suit might be unsuccessful or might like cause some animosity between you and the person you're suing. It wouldn't matter. We would still think your right is there nonetheless. Now, OWO kind of have a preemptive response. They say, but many of these things are not crimes. Number one, many are. Two, we will likely revise laws and update our conception of crimes after this comes into effect because people will see the possibility of this and know that this is something that they could utilize as a result. Second prong of extension is why alternatives in the status quo are insufficient. Opening government point to collaboration, but the problem is that political incentives are necessarily short-term. So whilst it might be desirable and some politicians certainly care about the environment, many will be voted out of office before those problems ever concretize or become actualized. So there's little incentive to care about them in many cases. And often these incentives are distorted by things like political lobbying. No opening government do talk about political incentives, but only insofar as treaties are concerned, not political policy more generally. The other possible alternatives, to be completely generous to the opposition, are maybe, for example, someone who has standing, you could, as an environmental group, fund them. The problem is, though, you generally want to be a part of that lawsuit because you're worried about the perceived lack of control if you're not a part of that lawsuit, being able to, for example, dictate the general direction of the case and the legal arguments that you are making. So it is better to have everyone having standing in that case, thus providing incentives for more people funding, more people coming to the table, and then enacting the lawsuit. And thirdly, trivially, obviously, it's very hard to establish jurisdiction in many cases, right? It's very technical, it's very complex. You have to prove that the direct harm occurred to you. You have to prove proximity, that you were there at the certain point in time. And like procedures are just complex, right? And just very difficult to understand. Like, I just think, for example, an indigenous tribe in the Amazon should not necessarily have their own burden to sue the Brazilian government for that damage. If they can get help from it, that's not just reliant on an NGO giving them some funding, I think this would be useful. And I think the importance of this material, again, just explains why we have an imperative to do this, simply because there's no other alternative. And I'm sorry, Owo, I don't know what your border adjustment mechanism is. I just think that's far too technical for this debate. But what's your POI?
So a border adjustment mechanism is where you charge people. No, sorry, my POI is this debate is obviously about criminal liability, not civil liability. We're quite happy to stand for universal civil liability. What is your case in the context where it's just criminal?
I don't think that this implies that like crime can be treated, okay, one-on-one for crimes, they can obviously have a range of punishments. So something can be a crime, doesn't mean you go to jail. You might pay a fine. That's probably what's likely to be the case in this instance and what we stand for. I think the distinction is kind of nebulous. The final, or maybe final thing I'm going to talk about is why this is good even if you are unsuccessful in court, because I do think opening opposition point to some reasonable compliance concerns. I would say, number one, there is a deterrence effect. Notably, OG only explained this in terms of corporations. I think this also applies to governments who do not want to have this dragged out in the media. They do not want lots of airtime. They don't want this to detract from other policy things. So more court cases in general, I think, is a significant deterrence for governments. But also, just having more court cases existing, because there are more people with standing in the first place, is a good thing because media tends to cover these things, particularly if they do go to a higher court, such as the ICJ, right? Which means that more people are aware of these things. They can then vote at the ballot box. You have more NGOs being able to raise money for these things, because again, they now have greater platforming of these issues. So if opening opposition is concerned about international collaboration, the awareness that necessitates that only comes when we get more awareness. And I think, again, the weighing for this material is clear. Number one, this provides far more certainty because it's not reliant on how the case will actually go, but it also explains why developing countries would opt into this. They don't necessarily need to be successful. They only need to be successful at raising awareness for Western countries that might be fucking them over. So for all of those reasons, we're very proud to propose.
I'd like to thank the Member of Government for what was a fine speech, and I'd like to call upon the Member of Opposition to begin the case for closing opposition. Hear, hear.
Hi, can you hear me well?
Yes.
Wonderful. I'm going to start in POI's chat. Okay, 3, 2, 1. I'm going to do 3 things in this speech. Firstly, I'm going to discuss mutual exclusivity and what specifically the trade-off here looks like and why that trade-off exists, extending on opening opposition who just say attention. Secondly, I'm going to discuss why other tools that would take the place of this are significantly less likely to incur the harms that this policy does, but are in fact likelier to address climate change concerns. And thirdly, I'm going to do the weighing for why even if government gets marginal changes on climate change, that is less important than those harms that are incurred. Firstly, I'm going to have responses to closing government primarily in the third part, but I'm going to be sprinkling them throughout, I guess, where they apply. Cool. Let's go firstly for mutual exclusivity. Opening opposition here says, look, otherwise we use trade tools and carbon borders in order to improve company behavior, and you probably have relatively few prosecutions anyway. I think I would note that that doesn't mean that you don't still have most of the good stuff unless you buy the material on attention. I want to go specifically into detail on this. I think the likely alternative by the countries OG identifies as using this mechanism of prosecution, i.e. countries that are activists on climate change, is things like legislation on chain of production, where you can only sell your goods, or you can sell your goods only at a high price if you pollute, or you can only sell your goods if you don't. I think that's what OO meant. I'm not saying this is the extensive part. I think this is the less technical version of what OO says. Cool. Why do we think this is actually meaningfully a trade-off, even if there is frequent failure of these prosecutions, and even if those prosecutions oftentimes are actually frustrating? 3 mechanisms. 1, these things arise as a result of politicians considering it in their interest to do it as a result of public pressure because they perceive votes as originating from it, due to things like people being willing to sacrifice their time and energy to go out onto the street and vocalize their concerns. That takes time, that takes energy out of people. This, especially if it fails, is incredibly frustrating. And note that frustration is the thing that takes the wind out of activist movements, because you see yourself having gone out to the street and done a lot and, spent less time with your family because you were going out to protest, and then it fails. And then you stop doing it eventually because people stop doing things that are not giving them, even the satisfaction of having achieved something good, at which point you don't get the thing that OO wants. Secondly, I think the attention economy specifically applies here in terms of people will focus on the lawsuit because it's flashy, right? It's a big bad corporation that is really easy to hate. And you listen to all the arguments that are made for why they committed a crime. And that means that time that you are following up on all of those news stories, this time you're not following up on what people are voting for in parliament, meaning you are less likely to get that legislation again. Thirdly, I think you also just have a sacrifice economy, i.e. if you successfully prosecute and your country takes some economic hit for this because they have to make a sacrifice because, they had to make a company pay a fine, meaning that company is less likely to be positively predisposed toward them in future, maybe prices go up as a result of that. That means you're less willing to take harms in future because you think you've already done your job and you've already taken the hit for climate change. It's someone else's job now, meaning you're less likely to be willing to incur whatever sacrifices exist of legislation, meaning there is a meaningful trade-off here. Secondly, other tools are better. 1, I think that they are just better on the metric of economic development and justice in that development. What does this mean? Look, we're going to be slightly nicer than OO to OG and posit that sometimes it succeeds, because some countries are really economically powerful and they can compel a CEO to pay a fine because the cost of losing business done in that country is higher than the fine, and sometimes that fine is paid, right? In those situations, companies are going to be scared that it could happen and they think that it is relatively unpredictable. The reason it's unpredictable is as a result of broadly 3 reasons. 1, you need fewer people to incur that risk because you just need 1 activist prosecutor as opposed to an entire parliament. Secondly, you have less warning because that prosecutor isn't likely to spend 2 years campaigning on a policy. They likely just do it relatively quickly. Thirdly, it is an immediate punitive action rather than something that you can gradually invest in your adjustment to, meaning that it is likely to be immediately more economically and competitively damaging, meaning that you are actually scared of this happening to you. I think this means that if you are doing business in a country that is unlikely to have the economic tools to coercively protect you from being faced by this, i.e. a country that has less money to bribe other countries not to prosecute you, a country that is less relevant for those other countries as a trading partner and therefore less able to constitute a meaningful loss if they don't like what you do, that means you are less likely to spend money in that country. That means developing countries are less able to make valid trade-off in a world that they have been given as a result of centuries of injustice to do things like make the cost of doing business really, really low in that place in order to ensure meaningful basic living standards for the people in that country that are currently there and that currently have real rights that are harmed by the fact that they are poor. That is something that we think is genuinely unfair, and taking that tool away from countries that have been screwed over is probably something that is principally wrong, and more wrong than denying individual relatively rich people, because those are the only people that can access the right that just talks about the ability to exercise a right to sue. Secondly, I just think the cost to economic efficiency is bad as a whole. Most companies are at risk from this because, think of transportation is a massive risk of being a crime against the environment. People need that money to be invested in actually doing business effectively, not in making yourself litigation proof in order to benefit. More on this in a moment, but I'll take a POI from, I guess CG is the only one here.
So for every case that you can probably think of where economic livelihood is being hurt, I could probably also think of another one for why environmental degradation is also hurting those economic livelihoods.
Yeah, but you're not successfully prosecuting environmental degradation in most cases, which I'm going to get to now. 2 reasons why this is actively bad. 1, this means that companies invest less in, making transportation more efficient in order to get goods to people, in order to make the cost of living, acceptable to people, which I think is an impact that is intuitive in the context of massive inflation, making people incredibly poor. Secondly, though, it means they invest the money that they are currently spending on innovating to become less vulnerable to future legislation on climate change in making sure that they can fight lawsuits effectively, because oftentimes countries can do that because they have larger resources than most individual prosecutors. That is money that they should be spending on innovation. They are not doing it at the point where the cost of them not being litigation proof is much higher than the future cost of them not being legislation proof. That is why it is worse. Look, climate change is incredibly likely to happen to a massive degree anyway. The rights of current people we are definitely hurting are significantly more important for adjudicating this debate than the potential benefits to future people who we are not sure what their preferences are and who we are not sure we can meaningfully affect anyway as a result of everything I've said.
That's time. I'd like to thank the member of opposition for his fine speech, and I'd like to call upon the government whip to close off the case to closing government. Here.
Am I audible?
Yes.
Yeah, cool. Ideally for POI, just wave, but I will ask one of you at some point. Oh. Two things in the speech, a lot of principle justification, which actually I think takes out the majority of CO's extension as well. And then secondly, YOO are wrong and we do get impacts, which is what my POI was trying to do. But anyway, okay, valid justification to make a choice was what CO essentially run, is that the poorer states get to make this decision to fuck up their environment because colonialism fucked them over and they deserve to develop. 2 reasons. No, that is not a valid justification. Massively impacting the lives and livelihood of not only your own citizens, but all of the citizens of the world does not mean you have is not an impact we can stand over principally. Why so? In a normal criminal sense or civil sense or whatever fucking law actually understand, I think it becomes massively problematic for CO to stand up and say, look, if you were harmed in the past, you are now justified in harming somebody else because it gets you economic power. First of all, on a basic legal principle sense, this is not how we apply any of our laws. Victims of horrible economic trauma or physical trauma don't get to hurt other people. Note especially that this isn't necessarily hurting the people who hurt you, it's hurting other innocent victims. Notice Jess in her POI also says that it's not necessarily even one for one. It's not like we're equally just punishing the poorer countries. Notice Bangladesh is literally probably going to disappear in the next 20 years. Well, that was the last time my case filed. It could be more at this point, right? I think that at this point, it is unjustified for both opposition teams to stand over and say this is the West trying to hurt those more developing countries, when in reality it is often the most developing countries that are the most impacted, whose citizens are dying, whose citizens don't necessarily have the economic strength to themselves protect themselves from this, and therefore they need a legal protection from this. I want to be very blunt and say that, look, ultimately there are certain things that as humanity we don't stand over as being justified. When I asked a POI about international war crimes or things like that, it wasn't necessarily just that I love the ICC or the ICJ, because yeah, okay, they're not the best courts. It was to say that there are specific harms that principally the world does not stand over, and it is not justified for individual states to harm their population or individual companies within those states to harm that population. In the same way, when Poland was doing terrible things to its own women, a lot of courts around Europe and the world with equal standing in terms of law said this wouldn't pass in our law or in our jurisdiction. They were able to give legal justification as to why this was an unjust law. The problem with both opposition teams is they hope that governments will put their people first, either economically in closing opposition, or, I don't know, make trade agreements that are somewhat better in opening opposition, or legal agreements that are somewhat better in opening opposition. The problem is very often this looks like individuals within countries being able to band together and get legal expertise from elsewhere within the world to defend them. This is the only motion and mechanism in which that can happen, because the comparative that they want to say of people banding together requires a law that people can band together around. Notice this is not just necessarily the poorest countries that don't have legal strongholds. Notice the US Supreme Court were given information that was explaining to them that hurricanes were going to keep happening, that US citizens were going to die, but they ignored it and they put in bylaws about regulation so that their country could continue to make more profit. It is not ever justified to put the money that you may or may not make above the cost of life or the cost to the environment of your citizens. Note, as Jessica says, politicians very obviously are there for a shorter term period than both the populations that they serve and the world that we all live in, meaning it is unjustified for their laws or their own opinions to massively impact the rest of the world forever. That becomes massively something that we can't principally stand over. Last thing on this point is that Kat likes to say that this is money that could be spent on innovation, but actually it's being spent on protecting themselves or paying bribes or whatever. I want to call bullshit on this and note that most of the companies that you say should be investing in innovation, notice that was never explained, or what that innovation looked like, or how that benefits, or how the environment improves at any point based on innovation, right? I think that A, they never proved that those companies would spend that money in any other place. B, we actually give you a mechanism as to where money can help them in the long term. I'll go on to that first, but I will give you a chance to engage.
You might claim it's not rational, but your own analysis about politicians from Brazil and Bangladesh shows that they don't want this. And having been warned by China for decades about coercion, why don't they now turn away from the
Didn't say politicians, said people. So I think at the point in which the people of Bangladesh are able to use international law to hold their own, in some cases their own governments, in some cases other governments, in some cases companies, like, we think that ultimately this is a universal jurisdiction in which you can hold the people who are fucking over the environment, be it your own state, be it a different state, be it a different company, be it a different individual, accountable. This is what Jessica kind of said when she was like, I don't necessarily understand your POI when you said civil versus criminal. If someone is harming you legally, be it civil or criminal, this is a mechanism in which there will be somewhat universal jurisdiction. Cool. Yeah, okay. Political incentives. I just do think that ultimately that opening opposition and closing opposition largely want to say that there will be a loss here, right? The coalitions that otherwise would have happened are unlikely to happen under our side, primarily because they want to base all of this on this is going to be the West fucking over poorer countries. Two things on this. First of all, here's loads of reasons why it's unlikely to just be the bullying that they want to say that it's likely to be. First of all, in many of these situations, it is not the poorest countries or the most developing countries committing some of the worst cases to humanity. Notice that the US and China are the biggest polluters in the world. They have been called on it countless times, but their own courts and their own systems prevent us doing anything about it. Secondly, I think that the fact that like they want to say China is likely to take over under the system. I think notably a lot of the countries that are around China that are massively fucked over by how much they're screwing over their waters and their lands are likely to have cases against China. But noticeably, the public perception of past intervention means that places like the US or the UK or all the big baddies around the world were more likely to be reticent at the point where they do intervene. Notice, there has been a lot less intervention in the last 10 years than there would have otherwise been internationally. There are countries that are becoming more and more notable in the fact that they can call them out, meaning US is unlikely to do it unless it is a clear slam dunk. That was what I meant in POIs, insofar as the slam dunk cases we want to talk about are the inverse to what opening opposition want to say. And then just like sometimes developing nations do need to be held accountable. Sometimes it is not legitimate for them to fuck over the rest of the world for a minor economic benefit, which also long-term hurts their population insofar as all of the corruption and all the laws and all the horrible workers' rights or lack of workers' rights that are brought into their country. Ultimately, CO say that you are unlikely, I know my time, CO
time.
say that you are unlikely
that
to
is
engage.
That is time though, Lucy.
Oh, I had one last sentence, Joseph, but okay, thanks.
I would like to thank the government whip for what was a fine speech, and I'd like to call upon the opposition whip to close off the case for closing opposition. Hear, hear.
Cool.
We're approaching a minute, Lucy.
I'm gonna take my full minute now that I can. Okay, cool. I'm just gonna assume I'm audible. Yeah.
You are.
Brilliant. Okay. I'm going to do two things. One, how this will likely be done and why this is not going to be applying to the big cases that GovBench wants. Secondly, what the harms are to the countries that will end up being prosecuted / the companies that will not be prosecuted, while they are significantly worse than what opening opposition is talking about. One, why this is likely going to be done. So opening government and closing government have a couple claims about why this is not going to be done in a bad way and why it's not going to be just big countries bullying the small ones. One, they say that you have an incentive not to prosecute with some like fragile kind of evidence because it would hurt your capacity to then trade with the smaller countries, so you will not do that. Look, to the extent that opening government is characterizing that the small countries and small actors currently do not have the leverage on their side to be doing things like asking for environmental regulations or prosecuting, I'm generally unclear as to why they have the leverage to refuse trade in case that you are trying to prosecute them unfairly. By their own mechanization, I'm unclear why that works. Secondly, they say that you have to have buy-in. So if it's bad, then they will have to say, then they will be able to refuse to cooperate. One, this obviously hurts their impact. But secondly, in some cases, in the cases that we are talking about, when the actor that is being prosecuted has significantly less leverage, then you can apply the pressure, right? Then you have a big country being able to bully a small one into cooperating if you do have the economic leverage to force them to. Lastly, they say that you have a trial and you have defense. But again, even if you have defense, right? If it's the US prosecuting a small developing country, then like for a crime, then trivially, the US can probably afford to outlawyer them relatively easily. I think then what happens is that the opening government's mechanism prove exactly why you would not have this done the good way. and why you would not be able to prosecute the big guys and the big companies that they want to prosecute, right? Because exactly for those reasons, this won't happen. Like, they actually would have good defense, right? They actually would have good leverage to say, I'm just refusing to cooperate. They would have the capacity to withdraw economic benefits and trade in case that you are trying to prosecute them. This is why the where in what will occur, and this is where we are generous. We say they will be able to prosecute sometimes, but where they will be able to prosecute will be the actors who do not have the leverage, where you can bully them around, right? Lots of this response to the closing government principle, right? Because the closing government principle is like, but like you should be able to like universally sue, right? The issue is they are not allowing people to universally sue by their efficiency, right? This is benefiting people who already have their rights to sue, like being able to being relatively fulfilled, right? It is marginally better at best, but they are violating the rights to economic development that we do posit that countries in fact have, because of all the reasons that CUDS gives you in fact, because of historical disadvantage. What then are the harms? I want to be clear about what opening opposition says, right? Opening opposition 1 makes some assertion about that the individuals in developing countries are short-termist and uneducated, and therefore they will be angry and they will not buy in. The entire impact is that countries will get, or people in countries will get angry, and they will be stopped collaborating elsewhere. I want to be clear, right? Like, I will posit that there are other reasons why countries will want to cooperate on other things, right? Like there's other incentives like trade, right? You want to be cooperation is generally useful in other aspects, right? Like the fact that ICC is shitty did not like yet ruin the entirety of the world order and how we are like collaborating on other stuff. This is not a knife. This is just marginalizing and weighing as to why our stuff is more important, right? We posit that the reason as to why people would be angry about this is not because they are uneducated and short-term, we have to explain to them what the effects of climate change would be on them. The fact is that there are actually very severe trade-offs that it was create that are really difficult to morally adjudicate in between. How this then messes up countries, right? 1, Kat explains that this creates an incredible chilling effect for companies and for countries that enables them to economically develop, right? Opening government here concedes that it is going to happen. They say companies are going to be really afraid of being prosecuted. This is actually really bad, right? Because what happens on the status quo is that company wants to invest in a country, and 1, you know what the laws are. It's really easy to inform yourself about what the laws are in the particular country that you want to be investing in. Significantly harder to be informing yourself on what laws are in every single fucking country that could now prosecute you. But secondly, you can negotiate with the government, right? You can establish certainty about what the legislation will look like. You are able to have certainty about what your economic operations in those countries will look like. And know that these countries do have some kind of leverage on how the companies can't just completely push over these countries, because they do have an incentive to invest. They want to get some market out of it. So you can negotiate relatively effectively. The thing that happens now, right, is that they on our side, they can operate, they can make a long-term plan. On our side, they do not get to do that, right? Because that competitive advantage that lots of developing countries currently have in being able to negotiate environmental regulations disappear at the point where like you are risking that anyone from anywhere can now prosecute you. Is significantly harder in being able to both invest into these countries, but also doing some kind of long-term planning, right? Like you have to be investing loads of money into insulating yourself from loads of like potential idiotic prosecutions. So it's less likely you're able to do long-term planning. There's incredibly important things like tech sector development, etc., which by the way is incredibly useful to develop things that can then insulate these countries from effects of climate change later, or give them the development that actually does give them the leverage to be to be able to prosecute by themselves, right? Closing government has responses to this, but before I talk about them, I have to take closing government. I would take opening, but I'll take you then.
Yeah, but like largely they still have competitive advantage. They still have lower cost of living, still lower cost of payment, still lower cost of building a factory. And actually now they have more leverage as far as they say, come to us or we'll sue you for how much you fucked us over environmentally.
They can't sue you because I've already explained why not, right? But the issue is that the competitive advantage gets significantly lesser at the point where you have to be spending so much money on the insulation, right? Because of that, you are losing it, and you are wasting all the money that Kat describes you are wasting. One then CG says in response, first they say that economic benefits are unjustified because it does not weigh over loss of life. I am not sure why they think that the loss of economic development leads to. I will posit that it also leads to loss of lives to the extent that like people are not getting food on their tables and stuff like that. I think that probably is equally problematic. But also, like, then they claim that the people do not want it and governments are pushing them, right? Like, know that often they do want the economic development. Governments are not like all powerful, be bullying their citizens into accepting economic development. Like, they do not want people to riot. They often are actually, like, to some extent, what's the word, accountable, right? Also, we know that there are better alternatives, and we do actually give you the weighing as opposed to the entire government asserting as to why economic development that is certain right now is more important than benefits from climate change reduction that might not be actually leading to any benefits in the future. I did have weighing for overall, but I think it was already clear for all those reasons, CEO.
I would like to thank the opposition whip for his fine speech, and I'd like to thank you all again for that debate. At this point, we're going to go to adjudicate, but I imagine there's some